Title: The Seven Trials and the Last Warrior. In a distant land, where the mountains touch the sky and the seas whisper ancient secrets, there existed a prophecy. The prophecy spoke of 7 trials, each more difficult than the last, and a single warrior who would rise to face them all. This warrior would not be chosen by birthright or strength, but by the trials themselves. For only the one who succeeded would be worthy of wielding the power to protect the world from an approaching darkness. Our story begins with a young man named Kale, a humble village dweller, unaware that the trials were meant for him. Kale lived a simple life. He spent his days tending to the fields and helping his village in any way he could. But on the eve of his 20th birthday, the village elders gathered in secrecy. They spoke of the trials, and of the last warrior who would face them. As Kale was walking home from the fields, an old woman, cloaked in tattered robes, approached him. Her eyes gleamed with a strange wisdom. "You are the one," she said, her voice soft yet commanding. "The 7 trials await. You must prepare, for the world is on the brink of destruction." Kale, confused and fearful, tried to refuse. But the woman insisted, "The trials will come, whether you are ready or not. It is your destiny." The first trial came swiftly. The villagers, upon hearing the prophecy, were divided. Some feared Kale's potential, while others believed in him. The first challenge was a test of strength, set in the heart of the ancient mountains. Kale was to face a beast known as the Roc, a giant bird that had terrorized the region for centuries. With nothing but his sword, Kale climbed the treacherous cliffs, feeling the weight of his doubt with every step. The battle was fierce. The Roc's wings could send gusts strong enough to break trees, and its claws could crush stone. But Kale's resolve was unyielding. After a long and exhausting fight, he struck the Roc down, proving his strength, but at a cost. His arm was wounded, and his spirit was tested. As Kale stood victorious, the voice of the old woman echoed in his mind, "Strength is not enough. The trials will demand more than just power." The second trial took him deep into a labyrinth beneath the earth, where the walls seemed to shift with every passing moment. Kale was faced with riddles, puzzles, and illusions, each more perplexing than the last. Here, brute force would do no good. To succeed, Kale had to rely on his mind and his heart. For days, he wandered the maze, wrestling with his doubts. The deeper he ventured, the more he felt the weight of his destiny pressing on him. But eventually, with determination and clarity, Kale solved the final riddle. The walls of the labyrinth parted, and he emerged into the light, wiser than before. "The mind is as powerful as the body," the old woman had whispered to him, "but neither is enough without the heart." The third trial was the hardest Kale had faced yet. He was led into a dark forest where the trees seemed to watch his every move. Shadows and whispers haunted him as he walked deeper into the unknown. Soon, he encountered the creature of the forest, a terrifying, shape-shifting being that could appear as anyone or anything. It tempted Kale with visions of his greatest fears and desires. In one moment, it appeared as his mother, long lost to the dark forces of the world. In another, it took the form of his beloved, who had vanished without a trace years ago. But Kale, heart pounding and mind racing, refused to be swayed. With unwavering courage, he faced the creature head-on, acknowledging his fears but not allowing them to control him. As the beast retreated, it whispered, "The greatest enemy lies within." The fourth trial was different. Instead of facing enemies or puzzles, Kale found himself in a village suffering from a terrible plague. People cried for help, but the disease spread relentlessly. Kale had no powers to heal, no magic to wield. He could only offer comfort, care for the sick, and provide strength to the grieving. The villagers were desperate, but Kale remained steadfast. He helped where he could, and slowly, the plague began to recede. It was not a victory won with a sword, but with compassion, kindness, and a steady heart. Kale learned that sometimes, the greatest strength lies in the ability to care for others. As Kale journeyed onward, he reached the 5th trial, where he was forced to confront his deepest loss. In a valley between 2 towering mountains, he was presented with a choice: save his own life, or the life of someone he loved dearly. The old woman's voice echoed in his mind once more: true strength comes from sacrifice. Kale hesitated, torn between his love and his desire for survival. But in the end, he chose to save the life of another, knowing that he could not face the world with his own hands stained by selfishness. As a result, Kale lost something precious to him. Yet, in the depth of his sacrifice, he found a strength beyond measure. The final trial was unlike anything Kale had encountered. He stood at the edge of a great abyss, a chasm that split the land in 2. Across it stood the source of all darkness, a great, shadowy being that sought to consume the world. To defeat it, Kale had to leap across the chasm. There was no bridge, no way to cross except through faith. But as he took a step forward, he realized that it was not his strength, wisdom, or courage that would allow him to defeat the darkness. It was his heart. With his heart full of hope, love, and everything he had learned along the way, Kale leapt into the unknown. He flew across the abyss, and in that moment, his true power was unlocked. The darkness shattered, and peace returned to the world. Kale returned to his village, not as a young man, but as a warrior who had faced the trials and emerged stronger than ever. He understood now that it was not the trials themselves that shaped him, but the choices he made along the way. Strength, wisdom, courage, compassion, sacrifice, and love, these were the true keys to saving the world. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but Kale knew that the journey had only just begun. Though Kale had defeated the darkness and saved the world, the journey was not yet over. His victory over the shadowy being had not only restored peace to his land, but it had also awakened ancient powers that had lain dormant for centuries. As Kale stood on the edge of the battlefield, now calm and bathed in the light of dawn, he noticed something strange. The earth beneath his feet trembled gently, as if the world itself was adjusting to the changes brought by the trials. In the distance, the mountains began to glow faintly, their peaks shimmering with a golden light. The winds carried whispers of ancient spirits, and Kale felt the pull of something greater than himself. A figure approached him from the horizon, a figure dressed in shimmering robes, carrying a staff that seemed to pulse with an ethereal light. As the figure drew closer, Kale recognized her. It was the old woman who had set him on his path so many years ago. "You did it, Kale," she said, her voice filled with both pride and sorrow. "The trials have been completed, and the darkness is no more. But the world is not the same. There is more to this world than what you have seen. There are realms beyond, places untouched by the light, where other forces are stirring. The power you have unlocked is the key to understanding them." Kale looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he felt the weight of his journey. "What comes next?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. "You have completed your trials, but there are more to come." The 7 trials were not just about defeating darkness, they were about awakening the balance of the world. You now possess the power to safeguard that balance. The next step of your journey will take you beyond these lands, to places untouched by light and shadow, where new trials will await you. Kale knew that he could no longer return to the quiet life he had once known. He had seen the truth of the world, the hidden forces that shaped it, and the mysterious powers that lay dormant in forgotten realms. The trials had shaped him, but they had also opened his eyes to a deeper truth. Peace was fleeting, and the darkness was only one part of a much larger struggle. The old woman handed him a map that was incomplete and fragmented. "This will guide you to the next trial," she explained. "But beware, what lies ahead is not like what you have faced. These realms are unknown to the people of this world. The beings you will encounter may not be friendly, and the challenges you face will test every part of your being. But remember what you have learned: strength is not just in the sword, wisdom is not just in the mind, and courage is not just in the heart. True power comes from the unity of all these things and the willingness to make sacrifices for the greater good." Cale took the map with a solemn nod. The journey ahead would be perilous, but he was no longer the naive farm boy he had once been. He had grown stronger with each trial, and now, he would face whatever lay beyond with the full force of his newfound wisdom. As he set off towards the horizon, the old woman's voice called out to him one final time. "Remember, Cale, the trials never end. They are part of a greater cycle, a never-ending quest for balance. You are the last warrior, but there will always be new warriors to rise. The world will always need those who are willing to fight for it." The first destination on the map led Cale to a hidden valley, a place where time itself seemed to slow down. As he ventured deeper into the valley, the air became thick with magic, and the land seemed to shift beneath his feet. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted and gnarled, with strange markings carved into their bark. It was here that Cale met the first of the beings he had been warned about: a creature of the forest, neither human nor animal. It had the shape of a man, but its eyes glowed with an otherworldly light, and its skin shimmered like the leaves in the wind. "You seek the next trial," the creature said, its voice like the rustling of leaves. "But this land is not one that can be conquered through strength alone. To face the trials here, you must first understand the magic of the land. Only then will you be worthy of what lies beyond." Cale stood tall, his sword at his side, but he understood the creature's words. "I am ready," he replied, his voice steady. "Show me what I must learn." The creature smiled, and for the first time, Cale felt the weight of his journey truly sink in. This was not just a test of physical strength or intellect, it was a test of his very spirit. To succeed, he would have to embrace the magic of the land, to connect with the forces that flowed through every living thing. And only then would he be ready to face whatever awaited him next. The 7 trials were not an end, but a beginning. Cale had proven himself worthy, not through defeating darkness alone, but by embodying the very qualities that made him a true warrior: strength, wisdom, courage, compassion, sacrifice, and love. But as he ventured into unknown realms, he realized that the journey was far from over. Each step brought new challenges, and each challenge would push him to evolve further. For Cale, the trials were not a destination, they were a path. And the path was endless, leading him through uncharted lands, meeting beings both strange and familiar, and constantly testing the limits of his heart. And so, Cale's story continues, a story of a warrior who does not fight for glory or power, but for balance, for peace, and for the world he has sworn to protect. Cale's journey into the unknown began to test him in ways he had never anticipated. The valley, once so tranquil, began to fade behind him as he followed the map's winding trail, moving deeper into the wild and untamed lands. The land began to shift, as if responding to Cale's very presence. A deep sense of foreboding settled over him, and he soon found himself standing before a vast and endless stretch of land, shrouded in an eternal twilight. The sky above him was not the blue of day nor the black of night, it was a gray, oppressive hue, as if time itself had ceased to flow. Cale felt a coldness settle over him, seeping into his bones. He could not explain it, but he knew that this place was not meant to be visited by mortals. It was a realm untouched by the sun, a place where shadows ruled and hope seemed a distant memory. The first step into this forsaken land was like stepping into a different world. The very air seemed to whisper, filled with voices from the past, echoes of those who had come before him, and those who had failed. He could feel their sorrow, their desperation, and the weight of their unfulfilled quests. Yet, Kale did not falter. He had faced darkness before, and though this was a new, more insidious kind of evil, he was determined to push forward. The trials had already taken him through pain, suffering, and loss. This realm would be no different. As he walked deeper into the mist, Kale noticed something stirring in the distance, figures cloaked in darkness, their forms shifting like shadows themselves. They moved with purpose, but without sound, their eyes glowing faintly as they gazed at him. "Who are you?" Kale called out, his voice unwavering. The figures stopped, as if considering his words. Then, one of them stepped forward, a tall, gaunt figure draped in tattered robes, his face hidden beneath a hood. "We are the guardians of the night," the figure said, his voice like a cold wind. "You have come to the realm of eternal night, seeking the next trial. But be warned, mortal. The trials here are not like those you have faced. They will test the very core of your being." Kale stood tall, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "I have come this far. I will face whatever challenge awaits." The guardian's eyes glowed a deeper shade of red, and for a moment, Kale thought he saw something like pity in them. "Very well. But remember, every trial in this realm demands a sacrifice. And only those who understand the true cost of their journey may pass." With a wave of his hand, the world around Kale seemed to twist and warp, and he found himself standing in a desolate, barren landscape. The ground beneath his feet was cracked, and in the distance, he could see what looked like the ruins of an ancient temple. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, broken only by the distant echo of what sounded like a child's laughter. The guardian's voice echoed in his mind. "To pass this trial, you must face your greatest fear. But you must also confront the part of yourself that you have long buried, the part that you have refused to acknowledge. Only then will you be allowed to move forward." Kale's heart clenched. He had faced darkness in many forms, monsters, betrayal, and loss, but this trial would be different. This trial would force him to face himself. The ruins ahead beckoned Kale, and he approached cautiously, his sword drawn. As he entered the heart of the ruins, he found himself standing before a massive, ancient mirror. Its surface was dark and reflective, but as Kale gazed into it, he saw not his own reflection but something far darker. In the mirror, Kale saw a version of himself, but one twisted by shadows. It was him, but not him, a creature of rage and despair, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His hands clenched into fists, and his body trembling with the weight of his own hatred. This version of Kale wore a crown of thorns, a symbol of the darkness that had nearly consumed him before, a darkness he had fought so hard to escape. "You have always feared this part of yourself," the voice of the guardian echoed in his mind. "But it is not just fear that will stop you. It is the refusal to confront it. You cannot continue your journey until you face this darkness, acknowledge it, and accept that it is part of you." Kale's grip on his sword tightened, but he did not draw it. He knew that this was not a battle he could win through force. This was a battle of the mind, of the soul. The version of himself in the mirror began to laugh, a deep, hollow laugh that reverberated through Kale's chest. "You are weak, Kale," the dark version of himself sneered. "You have always run from your true nature. You have ignored the rage inside of you, pretending it doesn't exist. But it does, and it always will. You cannot fight the darkness forever." Kale closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. He could feel the darkness rising within him, but he also felt the light. The warmth of the friendships he had forged, the love he had for the world he sought to protect, the hope that still flickered inside of him. He was not just the warrior, the hero. He was human, flawed, and imperfect. And that was what made him strong. I have faced darkness before, Cale said softly, opening his eyes. I have made mistakes. I have been angry, but I will not let that define me. I choose to fight for the light, even when it seems impossible. You may be a part of me, but you will not control me. As Cale spoke these words, the dark figure in the mirror began to fade, its form shattering like glass. The mirror itself cracked, and with a final shudder, the reflection of Cale's darkness disappeared, leaving only his true self standing before the ruins. The moment the dark version of himself vanished, Cale felt a sense of release. The weight that had clung to him for so long was lifted. He had confronted his fear, faced the darkness within, and emerged stronger. But the journey was far from over. He had passed the trial of the realm of eternal night, but he knew that this was just one of many steps in his ongoing quest. As the landscape around him began to shift once more, the guardian appeared before him, his expression unreadable. You have passed the trial, Cale. You have faced your greatest fear and accepted it. You are now ready for the next challenge. Cale nodded, a fire burning in his chest. I will face whatever comes next. I will continue to fight for balance, for peace, for this world. The guardian's eyes flickered with something like approval. Then go, Cale. The path ahead is still long, but you will not walk it alone. The light within you will guide you, even in the darkest of times. With those words, Cale stepped forward, the map guiding him into the unknown, knowing that each trial would bring him closer to his ultimate destiny, a warrior not just of strength, but of wisdom, courage, and heart. Cale stepped into a cavernous hall, the very air heavy with the scent of molten metal and burning embers. The walls of the cavern pulsed with a warm glow, as if the very stone itself was alive, reacting to his presence. At the center of the cavern stood a colossal forge, its flames reaching toward the ceiling, illuminating the entire space in a fiery hue. The trial was clear to Cale. This was the Forge of Souls, a place where warriors' fates were shaped in the fires of creation. He could feel the heat pressing down on him, the weight of the forge's ancient power. The flames here were not like any fire he had encountered before. They were not merely destructive, but also transformative. As Cale moved closer to the forge, the figure of an armored blacksmith appeared from the shadows, his face hidden beneath a wide helmet. The blacksmith's presence was as imposing as the forge itself, and Cale knew immediately that this was another guardian, the keeper of the next trial. You have come for the Forge of Souls, the blacksmith said, his voice deep and resonant, like the ringing of hammer against anvil. This is not a trial of strength or skill, but of spirit. Here, you will shape your own fate. What you create in the forge will define the warrior you are to become. Cale nodded, his mind sharp with determination. He had learned that each trial was not just a test of his abilities, but of his character. The forge would shape not just his weapon, but his very soul. What he chose to create here would be the key to overcoming the challenges that lay ahead. Take your place, the blacksmith gestured to an anvil set in the center of the forge. Choose the material of your destiny. Cale approached the anvil, and before him appeared three materials: a gleaming silver ore, dark and molten like obsidian, and a translucent crystal that pulsed with an inner light. Each material represents a different path, the blacksmith explained. The silver is the path of purity, light, and honor. The obsidian is the path of power, strength, and darkness. The crystal is the path of balance, both light and dark, and the wisdom to wield them. Cale looked down at the materials, considering each one carefully. He had already walked the path of light and darkness, facing both in their extremes. But balance was what he had learned to seek in his journey. It was the key to understanding the world, to understanding himself. "I choose the crystal," Kale said, his voice steady. The blacksmith gave a nod of approval. "So be it. Now, shape your destiny." As Kale began to work with the crystal, he felt its energy flow into him, merging with his own. The heat of the forge surrounded him, but it did not burn. Instead, it empowered him, as if the very essence of the crystal was awakening something deep inside his soul. Hammering the crystal upon the anvil, Kale poured all his energy into the task. Each strike was a melding of his past, his fears, his hopes, and his strength. The crystal began to take shape under his hammer, its edges sharpening and forming into a blade. The sword was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of Kale's journey, a union of light and dark, of strength and wisdom. As he finished the final touches, the sword pulsed with a soft, radiant glow, its surface shimmering like the surface of a calm sea under the moonlight. Kale raised the sword in the air, feeling the weight of it in his hands. It was more than a weapon. It was a reflection of who he had become, a warrior who understood both the light and the dark, and who knew how to use both for the greater good. The blacksmith nodded. "You have crafted the sword of unity, a blade that will guide you through the trials ahead. But remember, Kale, a weapon is only as strong as the heart of the one who wields it. Do not let it consume you." Kale's grip tightened around the hilt of the sword. "I will not let it. This is not just a weapon, it is my path forward." The blacksmith stepped back, disappearing into the shadows. "Then go, warrior. The next trial awaits you. And with it, the final challenge that will determine your fate." As Kale left the forge, the world around him began to shift once more. The landscape became desolate, the sky now swirling with dark clouds, and the ground beneath him cracked and split. Ahead, Kale saw a figure standing at the edge of a great chasm. The figure was tall, clad in armor that gleamed with an eerie, unnatural light. Kale could feel the weight of the figure's power even from a distance. This was the last trial, the final warrior. The figure stepped forward, and Kale recognized him instantly. It was an older version of himself, a version from a future yet to come. The warrior's eyes glowed with the same fierce determination that Kale knew resided within him. But there was something else, a hollow emptiness in those eyes, as if the warrior had lost everything in his quest. "You have come," the older Kale said, his voice cold, devoid of the warmth that had once defined him. "I knew you would." Kale raised the sword of unity, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" The older Kale's eyes flashed with sorrow. "I am what you will become if you do not learn to balance the darkness and the light within you. I am the result of your choice. See if you lose yourself in your quest for power and vengeance." The last warrior's voice was a warning, and Kale understood that this trial was not one of victory or defeat. It was a test of the choices he had made and the choices he still had to make. "I will not become you," Kale said firmly, his voice steady despite the weight of the confrontation. The older Kale laughed bitterly. "You say that now, but what will you do when the world takes everything from you? What will you do when the darkness within you rises again, and there is no one left to fight it?" Kale's heart clenched, but he stood firm. "I will fight. For as long as I have breath, I will fight for the light." The older Kale's form began to fade, his armor cracking like shattered glass. "Then the final trial is over," he whispered. "You are ready." Kale stood alone, the last trial now behind him. The land before him had changed once more, the skies now clearing to reveal a bright horizon. The road ahead was no longer shrouded in darkness, but bathed in the light of dawn. With the sword of unity in his hand and the wisdom of his journey coursing through his veins, Kale knew that he was ready. He had faced the trials of light and darkness, of fear and power, and had emerged stronger. Now, it was time to face his true destiny. The last trial had taught him not only the importance of balance, but also that it was not the trials that defined a warrior, but the heart that guided their path. And with that, Cale took the first step into the future, ready to face whatever awaited him. Cale stepped forward, the weight of his journey settling upon his shoulders. The sword of unity was no longer just a weapon in his hand, but a symbol of the balance he had achieved within himself. The trials had tested him in every conceivable way, physically, mentally, and spiritually. But now, standing at the threshold of a new world, he knew the hardest battle still lay ahead, not with monsters or dark forces, but with himself. The path ahead seemed endless, stretching into the horizon, where the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the land. A new day was beginning, and with it, the possibility of change. The world had been shaped by countless trials and wars, but now it was time to rebuild. Cale felt the stirrings of hope, not just for himself, but for all the people he had encountered on his journey. As Cale walked toward the horizon, a soft voice reached his ears, carried on the wind. It was familiar, one he had not heard in a long time. Lyra's voice, the woman who had once stood by his side, guiding him with her wisdom and kindness. Cale, her voice whispered, "You have done it. The trials are over, but the real journey begins now. The world needs you not as a warrior, but as a leader." Cale stopped in his tracks, looking around for the source of the voice. But there was no one there, only the vast, empty landscape before him. "Where are you?" Cale called out, his heart racing. "Lyra, look inside yourself." Cale, her voice answered, soft and gentle. "You have always known the truth. The greatest power lies not in the sword you carry, but in the heart of the one who wields it." Cale closed his eyes, letting her words sink in. He had spent so long focusing on becoming stronger, on defeating his enemies and overcoming the darkness within. But now, he understood that true strength lay not in battle, but in the choices he made and the way he chose to lead. Opening his eyes, Cale looked at the sword of unity once more. The blade gleamed with a soft, steady light, its surface reflecting the golden rays of the rising sun. This was not a weapon to be used recklessly, but a tool for healing, for forging peace. The trials had been a test, yes, but they were also a preparation. Cale was ready not to fight the world, but to heal it. To bring together the broken pieces and unite the factions that had been torn apart by fear and war. Cale's journey was far from over. With the sword of unity in hand, he sought out those who had once fought alongside him, and those who had been lost along the way. It was time to rebuild the alliances that had fractured during the long years of war. He first found Rurik, the sturdy dwarf warrior who had once stood by his side in the depths of the ancient ruins. Rurik had been the first to teach him the importance of strength and unity, and now Cale needed his strength once again. "Rurik, old friend," Cale called out as he entered the great hall of the mountain stronghold. "The world is broken, and I need your help to fix it." Rurik looked up from the stone table where he worked, his eyes narrowing. "Aye, Cale," he grunted, his deep voice rumbling through the hall. "The world's been shattered, but it's not beyond repair. I'll follow you, lad, wherever your path leads. But remember, this time, we fight for more than glory." Cale nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "This time, we fight for peace." Next, Cale journeyed to the distant forests, where the elven clans had retreated after the wars had torn their cities apart. It was there, among the ancient trees, that he found Elandriel, the elven sorceress who had once aided him in unlocking the hidden powers of the ancient ruins. "You seek the elven armies, Cale?" Elandriel asked, her silver hair shimmering in the moonlight. "The elves are wary of war, but we are willing to help if you prove that your heart has not been consumed by the darkness. Kale looked her in the eyes, steady and firm. I have seen the darkness, and I have faced it. I will not let it claim me, or the world. Together, we can rebuild what has been lost. Elandriel studied him for a long moment before nodding. Then, we will stand by your side. But remember, true peace is not born from the sword alone. With Rurik and Elandriel by his side, Kale continued his journey, gathering the forces needed to unite the lands. The sword of unity now glowed brightly, a beacon of hope for those who had lost their way. Kale knew that the time had come to call upon the leaders of the fractured nations. They had fought long and hard, each seeking their own victory, but now the world was on the brink of collapse. There could be no peace without unity, and it was Kale's task to bring them together. In the grand hall of the newly constructed council, leaders from every nation gathered. The room was filled with tension, each leader wary of the others, each representing their people's hopes and fears. Kale stood before them, the sword of unity held high. We stand at a crossroads, he began, his voice calm but strong. For too long, we have fought each other, blinded by our own desires. But if we do not choose to unite now, we will all fall into ruin. The room was silent. The leaders exchanged uneasy glances, but none spoke. Kale continued, his voice unwavering. I have faced the darkness, he said, and I have learned that it is not defeated through war, but through understanding. We all want peace. We all want a future where our children can live free from fear. But peace does not come from the sword. It comes from the heart. For a long moment, no one spoke. But then, one by one, the leaders stood and pledged their support to Kale's vision. Rurik and Elandriel stood by his side, symbols of the strength and wisdom that he had brought together. With the leaders of the nations united, Kale and his allies set forth on their mission to rebuild the world. The journey ahead was long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time, Kale felt a deep sense of hope. The world had been shaped by darkness, but now it was time to shape it with light. The trials had been a test, but they had also been a preparation for what was to come. Kale knew that the true battle had just begun, one not of bloodshed, but of healing. And with the sword of unity in his hand, Kale walked forward, ready to face whatever challenges awaited him, knowing that he was not alone. For he had the strength of his allies, the wisdom of his trials, and the light of unity to guide him. Though Kale had united the nations and forged a new path forward, a shadow loomed over their newfound peace. Not all was well beneath the surface. Rumors spread of a new darkness rising from the deepest corners of the world, a force that threatened to undo everything they had worked for. Kale could not afford to ignore it. In the council hall, a new sense of unease settled. As the representatives of the nations gathered again, Kale stood at the head, looking out at the sea of faces that had once pledged their support. We are not finished yet, he began, his voice steady but filled with urgency. The trials were but the beginning. I feel the presence of something darker, something that wishes to tear apart the unity we have worked so hard to build. The room grew quiet as the weight of his words sank in. We must journey deeper into the unknown, Kale continued. There are forces we have yet to face, and we must not turn away from them. If we are to keep the peace we have forged, we must confront what lies beneath the surface, in the forgotten depths. Rurik, standing by Kale's side, grunted. We've faced monsters and dark sorcery, but if this is something worse, we need to be prepared. Elandriel nodded, her silver eyes filled with a quiet resolve. The earth and the stars speak of an ancient force, one that is older than the world itself. I fear this is no mere enemy. It is something far more dangerous. Kale's heart sank as he realized the full weight of their task. They had conquered the trials, but they now stood on the edge of a more complex battle. One that was not just for peace, but for survival. The journey to the abyss was long and treacherous. The map was unclear, the path unknown. Kale, Rurik, and Elandriel led a small band of trusted warriors and scholars, determined to uncover the source of the dark whispers. As they ventured deep into forgotten lands, they crossed treacherous deserts, navigated dangerous swamps, and climbed towering mountain ranges. With each step, the presence of the darkness grew stronger. The air felt heavy, the earth colder, and the sky darker. One evening, as the group rested in a cave, Kale sat apart, gazing into the flickering flames of their campfire. His thoughts were consumed with the unknown. What if this darkness was beyond their control? What if peace was a fleeting dream, doomed to shatter like glass? Rurik approached him silently, his heavy boots not disturbing the stillness of the night. "You're thinking too much, lad," he said softly. "We've come this far, haven't we? No turning back now." Kale nodded, trying to shake off the doubt gnawing at his mind. "I know, Rurik. But what if we aren't enough? What if this is a fight we can't win?" Rurik chuckled softly. "You've always been the one to question yourself, Kale. But remember this, you've already proven you're more than enough. Not because of the sword you carry, but because of the heart you have. The world needs that heart." Kale smiled faintly, grateful for Rurik's words. "Thank you, old friend." Elandriel's voice broke into the moment of quiet reflection. "We must continue. The abyss is not far now." Kale stood up, wiping the dust from his knees. "Then we move on. Together." They finally reached the edge of the abyss, a vast chasm that seemed to swallow the light itself. The air was thick with malevolent energy, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. Kale could feel it in his bones, the presence of something ancient, something hungry. At the center of the abyss, a dark portal swirled, its edges crackling with raw, chaotic power. It was a rift, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. Through the rift, Kale could see flashes of a world unlike any he had known, a twisted version of their own. Ruled by dark forces and filled with unimaginable horrors. "This is it," Elandriel whispered, her face pale. "This is the source of the darkness. The rift between our world and theirs." Kale felt the weight of the moment press upon him. "We need to close it. We can't let it spread further." But as he took a step toward the rift, a figure emerged from the swirling shadows. Tall and cloaked in black, the figure was a shadow of something both human and not. Its eyes burned with an unearthly fire. "I have waited long for this moment," the figure said, its voice like the whisper of 1,000 voices. "You think you can stop me? You think you can save your world? I am the darkness that has always been here. The fear you carry, the doubt you face, these are my gifts to you." Kale raised the sword of unity, its blade shining brightly in the encroaching gloom. "I am not afraid of you," he declared. "You will not consume this world." The figure laughed, a cold and hollow sound that echoed through the abyss. "You misunderstand. I am not here to destroy you, Kale. I am here to show you the truth. The world you have fought for is nothing more than an illusion. Your unity, your peace, these are fragile dreams. Soon, they will break." But Kale stood firm, his heart resolute. "Then I will break the illusion. For the future, for the people who believe in us, I will fight." With a roar, he charged forward, the sword of unity glowing brighter than ever before. The battle was fierce, and the darkness lashed out with all its fury. The world trembled, as if the very earth was resisting the change Kale was trying to bring. But Kale's resolve never wavered. He had faced the darkness within himself and had come out stronger. He had faced the trials, and now, he would face the greatest challenge of all. He would defeat the darkness that sought to claim his world. With a final, decisive strike, Kale plunged the sword of unity into the rift. The darkness screamed, writhing as the light from the sword pierced through it like a beam of pure hope. And then, there was silence. The rift was sealed, and the darkness that had plagued the world began to fade. Kale stood alone at the edge of the abyss, his sword still glowing faintly in his hand. His heart pounded, but the weight of the world seemed to lift. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Kale turned back to the path that had brought him here. He knew there would be much work ahead, rebuilding, healing, and learning from the mistakes of the past. But for the first time, he felt a deep sense of peace. The future was uncertain, but Kale knew one thing for sure: the world would rebuild, not in the shadow of darkness, but in the light of unity. And with that, Kale walked forward, not as a warrior, but as a leader, a guardian of the future. Though the rift was sealed and the darkness defeated, Kale felt a deep burden settling in his chest. The war had ended, the trials were over, but peace was never as simple as it seemed. The world was broken, and the echoes of the past would not simply vanish. As Kale returned to the United Nations, the people hailed him as a hero. Statues were built in his honor, and songs were sung about his victories. Yet, he felt disconnected from the celebrations. His thoughts were often clouded, not by the weight of the past, but by the future that awaited. The councils met regularly, each nation looking to Kale for guidance. They sought his wisdom on matters of governance, justice, and peacekeeping. But Kale knew that peace was fragile, and the work to rebuild would require more than just strength. It would need compassion, understanding, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. "I've fought wars, faced trials, and conquered darkness," Kale said to Rurik one evening, as they sat by a fire in the garden of the council hall. "But I don't know how to lead a world in peace. I don't know how to ensure that this unity lasts." Rurik chuckled softly, his voice low. "Aye, lad, leading peace is different from leading armies. But I've seen what you've done. You've got the heart for it. Sometimes, it's the quiet strength, the patience, that makes all the difference." Kale looked at his old friend, seeing the deep wisdom in his words. It was true. He had been a warrior, but now, he had to be something more: a guardian of not just the world, but the future of all who lived in it. As time passed, Kale began to see the fruits of his labor. The nations slowly healed, their bonds growing stronger as they worked together to rebuild what had been lost. Old wounds began to fade as new alliances were formed. The scars of the trials, though still present, became symbols of resilience and hope. Kale traveled between the kingdoms, meeting with leaders and citizens alike. He spent his days listening, learning, and teaching. He had grown from the brash young warrior who had first set out on his journey into a wise and thoughtful leader. He realized that leadership was not about commanding from the front, but guiding from within. Alandriel, now a trusted advisor, often joined Kale in his travels. Her knowledge of the earth and the stars guided their decisions, and her counsel was invaluable as the new age dawned. "It's not just about restoring what was lost," Alandriel said one day as they gazed out over a newly rebuilt city. "It's about creating something better, something that will endure." Kale nodded. "I've come to understand that. We cannot live in the shadow of the past. We must build a future that is brighter than the one we left behind." The people, too, began to realize that they were no longer just surviving, they were thriving. The trials had shaped them, but it was their unity that had forged their future. But even in peace, there were always challenges to face. Though the Great War had ended, there were smaller conflicts that arose. Old rivalries flared up, and new problems emerged. Kale knew that he could not solve every issue with a sword or a spell. He would need the wisdom and support of those around him to keep the peace intact. One fateful day, as Kale was preparing to travel to a distant kingdom to mediate a dispute, he received an unexpected visitor, an emissary from a land that had remained neutral during the war. The emissary brought with him troubling news. A powerful figure, once thought to be defeated, had resurfaced. This figure, known only as the Watcher, was said to possess dark knowledge and ancient sorcery that could unravel the very fabric of reality itself. The emissary's message was clear: the Watcher sought to challenge Kale for the throne of unity. He would stop at nothing to tear down the world Kale had worked so hard to build. "This is the last test," Kale said to Rurik and Elandriel. The trials were not just about overcoming monsters and magic, they were about proving that we could overcome the darkness within ourselves. But this will be different. This will test the very ideals we stand for. Rurik clenched his fists. "I knew this peace wouldn't last forever. But we've faced worse before. We'll face this together, Kale." Elandriel placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's not just the Watcher you're fighting. It's the fear that lies within every soul. The fear of change, of the unknown. You've already faced the darkness within yourself. This is the final trial." The Watcher, a figure draped in shadow and mystery, arrived at the heart of the United Kingdoms. His presence was suffocating, his very aura darkening the skies. Kale, Rurik, and Elandriel stood at the front of the council, prepared for the final confrontation. "You cannot defeat me," the Watcher declared, his voice echoing across the land. "You have united nations, you have conquered trials, but you have failed to see the truth. Peace is an illusion. It cannot last. I am the embodiment of chaos, the force that exists beyond order. And I will tear down your fragile world." Kale stepped forward, his sword shining bright in the shadow of the Watcher's power. "You are wrong. Peace is not an illusion. It is not easy, and it is not permanent, but it is worth fighting for. The world is stronger because of our unity. We will not let you destroy it." The battle that ensued was unlike any Kale had faced before. The Watcher wielded powerful, otherworldly magic, his attacks tearing apart the earth itself. But Kale stood firm, using the lessons he had learned from the trials, the power of unity, of love, of hope. In the final moments of the battle, Kale realized that the true power did not lie in his sword or his strength, but in the unity of those who stood by him. With a rallying cry, the people of the United Kingdoms rose to his side, their voices joining in one harmonious chorus. Together, they defeated the Watcher, not through force alone, but through the power of their shared belief in a better world. With the Watcher defeated and the peace solidified, Kale finally understood what it meant to be a true leader. It was not about wielding power, but about guiding others toward a future where they could thrive. The kingdoms continued to grow stronger, and Kale, now known as the Guardian of Unity, led them with wisdom and grace. His journey had been long and filled with hardship, but in the end, he had forged not just a world of peace, but a world where hope could endure, even in the darkest of times. And so, Kale's tale became a legenda story told for generations to come. Not of a hero who conquered darkness with a sword, but of a leader who, through unity and hope, brought light to the world. Years passed, and the world Kale had fought so hard to rebuild flourished. The cities thrived, the forests grew, and the people found harmony in their unity. But in the quiet corners of the world, something unseen stirred a whisper, barely audible, like an echo of the past. Kale had spent years traveling, meeting with leaders and working to keep the peace intact. But as the years went on, he began to feel a strange unease. The harmony he had worked for felt fragile, as if something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting to disrupt the peace they had all fought for. "Something is coming," Kale said one evening, sitting with Elandriel and Rurik by a quiet river. "I can feel it. The world is too quiet. Rurik, ever the pragmatic one, frowned. Could be nothing. But you've always had a keen sense about these things. What do you think it is? Elandriel looked up at the sky, her gaze distant. The balance is delicate, Kale. Even in times of peace, there are forces beyond our control. We've defeated the darkness before, but there are still unknowns out there. Kale nodded. The trials had shown him that peace was never permanent, and every victory came with a cost. But this time, it felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that this peace was being threatened in a way they had never anticipated. The peaceful world was jolted from its tranquility when a strange phenomenon began to occur. Entire regions of land started to wither, crops failed, and animals vanished. It began in the remote corners of the kingdom, but soon the effects spread, creeping into the heart of the cities. No one could explain it, but the signs were clear the world was dying. Then came the revelation that no one could have prepared for the Forgotten Ones. A race of ancient beings who had been sealed away for millennia had begun to awaken. They were the true origin of the darkness that had once threatened the world, and their power was beyond anything Kale had ever faced before. The Forgotten Ones were not like the Watcher. They did not seek conquest. Instead, they sought something far more terrifying: the destruction of all that was created, so that the world could return to its primordial state, chaos and void. The balance is shifting, Elandriel said gravely, her face pale. The Forgotten Ones do not wish to rule. They seek to undo everything, every life, every memory, every dream. Kale's heart sank. This was a threat not just to the world, but to existence itself. If the Forgotten Ones succeeded, nothing would remain. The trials had tested Kale's strength, but this would test everything he had become. Determined to prevent the destruction of everything they had built, Kale, Elandriel, and Rurik set out on a perilous journey. The Forgotten Ones were not bound by the same rules as mortals. They existed in the spaces between worlds, in the forgotten corners of reality. To find the source of their power, Kale and his companions would need to travel into the abyss, a realm where time and space lost meaning, where the laws of nature did not apply. It was a journey few had ever survived, and even fewer had returned from. As they ventured deeper into the abyss, the world they knew began to fade. The sky became a swirling void, and the land shifted beneath their feet. They encountered strange, twisted creatures, manifestations of memories and emotions long buried. Yet, despite the horrors they faced, they pressed on. Do you think we'll ever truly defeat them? Rurik asked one night, as they camped beneath a sky that seemed to twist and writhe. Kale looked up, his eyes reflecting the weight of the journey. I don't know, he admitted. But we must try. If we don't, we risk losing everything again. Elandriel nodded, her voice quiet but firm. The trials we've faced have not just been about defeating enemies. They've been about learning to protect what matters. The people we love, the world we cherish. That is worth fighting for. At the heart of the abyss, they finally came face to face with the Forgotten Ones. These ancient beings were not like any enemy Kale had faced before. They were an embodiment of pure destruction, silent, cold, and all-consuming. Their forms were ever-shifting, indistinct, and their voices echoed not in the air, but in the minds of those who looked upon them. You cannot win, one of the Forgotten Ones spoke, its voice a cacophony of whispers. This world was never meant to be. It is a fleeting dream. We are the true masters of time and space. Everything will return to the void. Kale stepped forward, his sword gleaming in the dim light. I've seen the darkness you bring, he said, his voice steady. I've seen the end, and I will not let it take this world. We will fight to preserve what is good, what is right. We will fight for the future, even if it means sacrificing everything. The battle that ensued was unlike anything Kale had ever experienced. The Forgotten Ones were not defeated by mere strength, they could twist reality itself, changing the very ground beneath Kale's feet, warping the air around him. But Kale did not fight alone. Rurik, Elandriel, and the spirits of the world, those who had stood with Kale before, came together in one final, unified assault. Together, they called upon the power of the trials, the strength of unity, the wisdom of compassion, the courage of the heart. The Forgotten Ones, though powerful, were overwhelmed by the light of the world they had sought to destroy. The abyss began to close, the void retreating as the Forgotten Ones were sealed away once more. The world trembled, but the danger had passed. Kale, Elandriel, and Rurik emerged from the darkness, their faces weary but triumphant. As the sun rose over the horizon, Kale looked out over the world he had saved again. This time, he knew that peace was not something that could be taken for granted. It had to be guarded, protected, and earned with every passing day. "We have won," Kale said softly, turning to his friends. "But the real work begins now. We will not forget the lessons we've learned. We will carry them with us, always." Elandriel smiled, her eyes filled with hope. "And we will build a future worth protecting." As they stood together, watching the dawn break over a new world, Kale knew that this was not the end of their story. The trials would continue, not as battles to fight, but as challenges to overcome, together. And so, the legacy of the 7 trials and the last warrior lived on, it in the victories won, but in the hope that each new day brought. That's the end of today's story. See you.